We should each be lucky to have great mentors in our lives. I was very lucky to have one such mentor. His name is Larry Greiner. He was a famous scholar from Harvard Business School. And if you haven't been exposed to Larry Greiner's work, he wrote a classical article called Evolution and Revolution as Organizations Grow. So he was one of my professors at University of Southern California when I worked on my MBA, and we became friends after that. And I actually consulted with him. He was very influential in getting my consulting business started, and ultimately, I used his growth theory for my doctorate. So he obviously had a lot of influence on me. So what he did was he took a very behavioral approach to organizational design, organizational theories, uh, and organizational designs. So he looked at the age of organizations and size of organizations, and then he looked at the various stages of evolution and revolution as these organizations grow, uh, thereby also overlaying the growth rate of the industry that this company is in. So those five elements and the intersection, particularly of those five elements, are the essence of his theory when we look at the dynamic picture of organizational growth. So let's kind of look at his stages that he came up with. He developed five stages. They're right here, starting out with creativity. You go through creativity stage, and then a stage of direction, where you're looking for direction for your company or organization. Delegation, coordination, and collaboration. And I'll talk about this a bit later. His research kind of ended here, but it eventually got extended. So as you're going through these stages, you run into various crises: crisis of leadership, crisis of autonomy, crisis of control, and red tape. And then later in his life, he kind of came up with this growth study. With this growth phase of alliances. So after coordination, or I'm sorry, after collaboration, should be alliances, and there's one more crisis here that you get involved in that. So let's look at each of those stages a little bit. Uh, like I said, the first one is a crisis of leadership. So a very interesting stage of any business once you get out of the creativity stage is getting into that leadership. Well, let's go back actually first and talk a little bit about creativity. Creativity uh, piece is where the company's founders are usually technical or entrepreneurial, and they're doing all of the management activities. If it's a small organization or one or two people, their mental energies are absorbed entirely in getting their new service or new product out the door. And there's no formal communications in that stage. Everything is kind of infrequent, and working long, long hours. Many of you can relate to that. And in particular, any kind of control of those activities stimulate from immediate market activities. You're environmentally focused, and the feedback that you get from what's going on with the marketplace kind of helps you to decide what you want to do. Okay, so that's that creativity phase. And so, as I said, you're going to go into a crisis of leadership. So let's talk about that crisis. Um, where in there, all the individualistic activities uh, are still rather essential to get the company going. But as a company is growing and it gets a little bit larger, uh, it requires a little more knowledge, a little more efficiency, and the informal communication may or may not work for you. Sometimes you need additional capital, and some of the funders aren't going to give you any capital if they don't have a sense of leadership. Okay, so there's a lot of management responsibilities that enter into your growth at that point. Matter of fact, it's almost imperative in this crisis level that you get some leadership going. The founders, though, sometimes want to hold on to how they had been doing things from the beginning, and almost 85% of the businesses die right there. That's a good time to bring on a consultant if you still have not figured it out. My consulting, Hamilton Solutions, does quite a lot of that. Okay, so let's just say though that you introduce some management approaches and you move through that. Then the next phase is direction, right? You're going through a direction phase, and that's good. When you get through that, your entrepreneur sometimes becomes the chairman or the president, and you generally establish a functional organizational structure: marketing, accounting, engineering, etc. Functional organizational structures. And if you have employees, you start to begin to look at job assignments and job roles. A lot of times you put together accounting systems. At least I suggest to my clients that you do such a thing. And communication now begins to get formal, right? You want to start putting together policies and procedures. You want to start thinking very carefully about the titles and positions that all your people hold. Be able to describe those as much as you possibly can. So let's say that everything is going well in that phase of direction. Uh, and although your energy is now, you think, a bit more controlled, it gets too large eventually, and you run into an autonomy crisis. An autonomy crisis. In that crisis, even though you have efficient growth, you eventually become inappropriate for controlling the larger, diverse, complex organization. The lower level employees find themselves restricted by cumbersome and this centralized hierarchy. They've come to possess more direct knowledge about their markets and machineries than the leaders at the top. Consequently, they feel torn between following those procedures and taking initiatives. Okay, that's a second revolution is imminent as a crisis develops from this greater demand for autonomy, and it's difficult for the managers who were previously as successful beginning phases. It's sometimes hard for them to give up that responsibility. So the lower level managers are accustomed to making decisions for themselves, and as a result, then you have the founder and centralized methods competing with the lower level employees, growing more um, uh, disenchanted. And if you don't fix this, they're going to leave the company. So we're assuming that we're going to fix that as well. And if we go to that next era, that next era of growth, then we are going to decentralize. That's where a lot of companies start to think about decentralization. Okay, so we've gone through the autonomy stage, and we will start delegating. The next phase is delegation. Okay, so delegation is decentralized. Much greater responsibility is given to the managers of plants or market territories. Profit centers are established, and you then maintain control by getting reports from the field. Okay, communication from the top sometimes is infrequent here because it's not necessary. Your lower level managers or project directors are penetrating their markets and they're doing well, right? So we let them go. But eventually, another problem evolves, another crisis evolves, what we call the control crisis, right there, control crisis. Eventually, that involves where freedom breeds a parochial attitude. Top management is seeking to regain the control over the company. Sometimes they return to a central management approach, sometimes not. But it has a lot to do, the need for this has a lot to do with the scope of operations being so vast now that the autonomous extensions aren't working so very, very well. Okay. So now it's time for, so that's that control crisis. It's time now for coordination. Okay, if we do things right, we start to move now into product groups. We at first were in function groups, but then we start to move into product groups. At this point, formal planning is imperative, absolutely imperative. Okay, we start hiring more people. We start worrying watching very closely our capital expenditures, making sure that they're applied properly across the organization. And if we're doing this right at this point, these product groups are treated like investment centers, not more than profit centers, investment centers, such that the profits are overflowing from them, and we can use those to develop new product areas or new market segments. Okay, pretty interesting phase of growth. Uh, it really causes for your field people who were very successful in a previous stage to actually take a look at the whole picture and be a part of the whole, and so they start to interact more with mid and upper management. All right, so um, eventually, though, you run into a bureaucratic nightmare. Companies eventually grow to the point where all these procedures are so disconnected that there's just too much red tape. It's a paper nightmare, hard to keep up with things. And so we have to get through that crisis and get into a phase. So that red tape phase kind of moves eventually into collaboration. Okay. So that collaborative stage is where Dr. Larry Greiner's studies stopped. Now, I don't want to pause. I don't want to move too past this because there is a lot of learning in that phase. You're working in team mode a lot, working with teams, a lot of self discipline, and many people become projectized. Matter of fact, matrix structures become pretty popular in that phase. And this is where the behavioral side of your organizational design is extremely important. Okay, you want to focus on solving problems quickly. You want to um, have conferences frequently to focus on these problem areas. Real time information systems might be important here. I'm also an information consultant, and this is a time when I tell a lot of people that you might want to start thinking about having real time information systems that integrate into the daily business activities of companies. Now, I mentioned that Eric Greiner was my mentor, so we did some consulting before, and he kept saying, I'm not sure where that growth model continues. You notice he had a question mark here. He wasn't sure where it was going to go. Well, before he passed away, I was very very sorry when my friend passed away. But before he passed away, the last phase then was a phase six or growth through alliances, and that's a lot how I work now. I'm a boutique management consultant. I work uh, with alliances. I have other strategic partners that I work with quite a lot, and um, it's sort of interesting because I had gotten to that with my doctorate studies uh, right around the same time that Larry Greiner got to adding that other phase into his model. So when you start thinking about this whole evolution revolution uh, model that I just walked you through, you when you're in evolution mode, sometimes you might evolve to that one of those phases. You might spend a couple of months in that phase, or a couple of years, depending on the growth of your industry. You want to work on incremental change within your organization, and incremental changes within the industries are something you're watching, and you try to match it. So there's a firm level lens you have, and there's an industry level lens you have. So on the firm level, you're adaptive. The industry is evolving now. So if you see your industry as an evolving industry, you want to be a little more adaptive. Where it becomes very, very complex is when the changes are what some scholars call a second order change, where now we're breaking some of these frameworks that we've grown up with, and the industry is more emergent. Okay, you may have even heard and read about the term punctuated equilibrium. You know, hours and hours of boredom interrupted by chaos. Is one term that some people throw on that. Okay, so I just thought that it might be interesting for you to know a little bit about what I do. I kind of overlaid some of Dr. Greiner's studies to Eric Erickson's studies of human development. He had about 8 stages that he developed, where you go from infant, toddler, preschooler, school age, adolescent, young adult, middle adult, and old adult. So I take that same kind of lens. Sometimes I look at companies. The autonomy stage that I talked about is a toddler stage for children, where you need to establish some determination and will in the child. An adolescent needs to be a little more loyal. They've pulled away from their parents, but they've started to bond with peers and friends in school, and they're looking at fidelity and loyalty, and they're playing off on those two things. When you become a young adult, new virtues into the game of love, or to make be, or to take care of things. And a middle adult type organization is maybe more into social good for their mission statement. So there's some similarities to Eric Erickson's theories as well, to looking at how organizations grow over time. So I thought that you'd find this interesting. A lot of people who know that I got my PhD, or my DBA, I should say, my doctorate in business administration, have asked, "What did you study? What did you study?" So that's kind of an overview of what I studied, and I continue to study that. My postdoctorate information, my postdoctorate research, then leads more towards agile technologies, and I'm sure you've heard that word out there. All right, so thank you very much for listening. Feel free to talk to me if you get a chance, and I can give you some more details of what my postdoc research is leading to. Thank you so much for listening.